Alright everyone, we start off today talking about how now, 24 hours after the fact, even the legacy media is actually panning what Biden said with regards to regime change in Russia. Hastily, almost instantaneously attempt to cover it up by the White House, Kamala and all these others. No. Biden wasn't calling for regime change, even though we have a goddamn explicit quote that can't be interpreted any other way. No, he was just talking about Putin not bullying his neighbors. That doesn't make any sense. The comment doesn't even refer to it. So even CNN, link in the description, archived of course, not going to give them free ad revenue, some clicks, simply because, you know, they're a broken clock at the moment. Even they are panning the comment and saying, well, we've got some questions to ask. Is this the right time to inflame the situation? Is this basically poking the bear? Is it dangerous? Now, of course, it's you know, begging the question. Of course, the answer is yes. Yes. Effectively insinuating that you would like to have a foreign leader assassinated or a coup attempted in Russia or something while there's a war going on where you're arming the other side is not the best when your stated position is twofold. Again, I'll analyze it from the same perspective as yesterday. The main problem here isn't Biden's unhinged rant in and of itself showing that he's demented, which is true. It isn't even threatening a foreign world leader. Trump did this with Kim Jong-un. Different circumstances, totally different level of power dynamic involved, so that made more sense strategically, but he did. That's not the problem. The problem is the U.S. says it's interested in diplomatic discourse, a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. keeps trying to edge ahead and talk to Vlad, and they won't even return the Pentagon's calls at the Kremlin right now, and keeps getting sidelined because of stupid shit like this. So right now, the Turks, the Israelis, and the French are sort of a rotating barrage of attempts of peace agreement talks, and Zelensky has agreed to a couple of the ideas that Putin had, but they won't even talk about demilitarization and the denazification horseshit either, as that would effectively turn them into a potato patch pawn of Russia. Think what you will about joining NATO. That's now officially, it appears, off the table, which should deflame the tensions there. It should take a little bit of heat off of things, but then you have Biden saying this. And the other problem, as I said, is actually age-old, which is the idea the Russians have complained for a long time. Hey, NATO effectively is trying to encircle us, destroy us, and subjugate us. Even though Russia initially, I think, tried to join NATO when the Soviet Union collapsed. Since then, it's been clear that they're not going to be partners and that Russia's not going to have co-equality in diplomacy with NATO and be on an even keel in that sense. When you insinuate that you want the leader of that country killed or removed from power, he can then use it as propaganda. And indeed, the Russian media immediately went into a 24/7 cycle of showing, I'm sure, everyone on Russian TV this quote and saying, look, Putin was right for the last 20 years. He kept saying that the Americans want him dead, the Americans have a big problem with him and with Russia, and Biden just, he proved it. He said the silent part out loud. Good going, Joey. Even CNN is panning you, and CNN are the biggest cheerleaders of the legacy media, other than maybe the New York Times, for the Biden regime. Now, first and foremost, before I get any further into this, keep in mind down below, if you're watching this video on YouTube, there will be a pinned comment down there with links to other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind I make exclusive material every day on those platforms that does not go on YouTube. Today I may or may not do a non-political video. That would go on YouTube too. I haven't decided yet because I got quite a backlog of material here. Anyway, again, the biggest problem here is that you screw up any potential for diplomacy involving the U.S. in doing this. The U.S. is an interested party. NATO's not directly involved in what's going on in Ukraine, but you're arming the Ukrainians. You're arming them, you're giving them diplomatic and ideological support, logistical support, etc. Other NATO members are even more directly involved, especially the Polish. They're talking about sending planes over now, and now the U.S. is not entirely off board with the idea of arming the Ukrainians further. That would probably be a problem. I think that would inflame tensions further. Think what you will about how it would help the Ukrainians, who appear to be making actually headway around Kiev, at least at the moment anyway, giving them, you know, air support. That would definitely give more propaganda to the Russians. The problem is this. It's a lose-lose situation because in part of the Biden admin's poor decision-making over the last year, and in part also poor decision-making under Obama, where Biden was VP, so he was directly involved too at the time. NATO, the only attempt to empower NATO to react to situations like this, and the only attempt to actually lean on the Ukrainians to basically de-corrupt their government, which would definitely help the propaganda effort right now for the West, was by Trump. Trump withheld some aid from the Ukrainians because they hadn't made enough progress, and this is part of the initial agreement in weeding out corruption, withheld sales to them, putting pressure on them. He also put pressure on NATO to up the amount of money spent by other members. Most of them fell far short. Now the Germans, later taters the party, they've agreed to pony up that money a year after Trump leaves office, of course. People said at the time, well, this is going to weaken NATO, you're going to fracture the alliance. All of NATO has just agreed to do exactly what Trump told them to do and tried to get them to do years ago. Beef up defenses. You don't need to expand. What you need to do is reform Ukraine. Ukraine can become effectively a liberal democracy. I hate to use that term because liberalism is, at this point, a mental disorder, I think. And democracy is a loose term. A constitutional republic that's not completely zonked out and corrupt. They were able to make progress. There was pressure put on them. Biden, instead, back when he was involved, added to the corruption. Hey, fire this prosecutor who's gunning after this company that my son happens to work for, I believe. Was what happened. By the way, CNN even talking about Hunter Biden's laptop at the moment. Sort of shoved down a little bit by other news, but there are actual mentions there. I think it's on the Hill as well, and NBC. Again, belated. That's good. A few people see it, even if it's all spin bullshit. Maybe they'll look up a tweet about it and they'll get the real skinny or a Substack article. Right now, we have a situation where mistakes made by several different administrations led to this situation. That doesn't exonerate Putin for the actual invasion. But if you're antagonizing Putin while making no progress in Ukraine and NATO remains weak because the U.S. is forced to pick up all the slack, what the fuck do you think's going to happen? Especially when Russia had already annexed Crimea. They had already shown a willingness to go into areas of Ukraine in which they had marginal support from certain parts of the population anyway, because they knew that they could do that without, expending a huge amount of manpower. So we knew there were several other provinces that wanted to form their own independent, Soviet-style states or something. They'll be just as corrupt as Putin or Zelensky. And you have a Ukrainian government that is angling to enter NATO. NATO responds in the affirmative, effectively inflaming the situation and causing Russia to say, okay, enough is enough. When you could have, effectively, what NATO could have done, number one, do what the Russians want, which is effectively enforce neutrality for Ukraine, take Ukrainian NATO membership off the table and say, look, we're not going to admit you to our military alliance. We can give you all sorts of aid, you can develop your own shit, and we're going to leave you alone, but you can't join NATO. The other possibility was a late-night session with a lot of hopped-up people snorting lines and smoking cigars, and they get Zelensky in there, under the nose of Putin, effectively, and say, look, you're in NATO now. Tomorrow, broadcast it to the world. We've officially invited you into NATO, and have some trucks ready and drive them right in around the capital and stuff. And the Russians, what are they going to do? Fire rockets at NATO forces? No, because that would cause World War III. We could have sideswiped the Russians, which would definitely cause the Cold War to escalate further, but Ukraine wouldn't have been invaded. Or we could have taken that off the table and said, look, we have no interest in Ukraine. You do, we don't. Obama made that clear, but he took no further action. He kept drawing red lines in the sand. Syria and Afghanistan and with the Chinese and stuff. He always held back when he did this, and inevitably the foe or the competitor state went over that line. China needs to trade fair, but I'm not going to engage in any tariff war. Trump was the only one that had the balls to do that. Syria better not use chemical weapons. Of course, crude chlorine bombs aren't the same as VX nerve gas. I understand that, and the rebels were the ones using the actual chemical weapons, it appears. The UN quietly admitting that part many, many years after it tried to get a war escalated there. A red line, Iran better not do this, Venezuela better not do that, shame on you Putin, don't you dare do this, and every single time he took a step back. The only exception was when he sailed U.S. naval carriers through areas that China claimed that it controlled, and China didn't do anything. That's basically it. When CNN is telling you that your rhetoric is beyond the pale, has become too dangerous, too antagonistic for the situation, you should probably shut the fuck up and 25th yourself. For God's sake, Joe Biden cannot remain in power. If anyone's a threat to world stability right now, it's Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. Putin has invaded a nondescript, non-nuclear state. He's a warmongering butcher, but he's not effectively escalating towards World War III by doing so. Ukraine's not in NATO. Ukraine has no nukes. Ukraine has a substandard, at this point maybe not, but overall capability in the military sense. Obviously, this isn't going to lead to the Ukrainians invading Hungary or sailing across and bombing Istanbul or something like that. The fact is, if Ukraine gets pissed off, the only people that can possibly have any problem with that are the Russians that have to go in and fight, to the point where the Ukrainians could force them back out of much of their territory. Nobody worries about Ukraine saying, okay, now that we've won around Kiev, we're going to roll into Russia towards Moscow. Yes, we're going to attack the Russians. That'd be a good idea. Nobody worries about that. Biden's rhetoric, meanwhile, is from one major nuclear power, with the dipole of the nuclear world against the other. It's the main NATO member, a giant nuclear alliance with a massively rising military capability. Over the next few years, you're going to see some super weapons and shit, versus the Russian-Chinese sphere, which is the other dipole of the military world. Again, nukes in Russia, manpower mainly in China, and at least some naval capabilities. Russia and China, I think, each have one aircraft carrier. So, 1/7 of what the U.S. has between their two countries. Or is it 2 now for China? I know one of them, they took it out of dry dock and it almost immediately sank the first time. They finally repaired it and it apparently works now. Still uses a fucking ramp, though. It's Biden's rhetoric that's dangerous. He's calling for regime change and a nuclear power, while claiming to want to de-escalate the situation. Hey, we need cooler heads to prevail, let's have peace talks. Yeah, that's going to really work. If Russia gets the sense that the U.S. is led by a war pig butcher that equal to Putin in some senses, that's going to hard-line them, why would they even want the peace talks? They'll just steamroll Ukraine and annex it entirely. You'll cause that to happen, Joe. Maybe that's his meaning. Maybe he wants Ukraine to be taken over, so more NATO borders, Russia, or a vassal state, a pawn state at that point, so that there can be more problems, more incidents. Maybe he's just nostalgic for the Cold War. Maybe Joe Biden, his brain is so fried he's got nostalgia for the 50s and the 60s, back when they had duck and cover and shit like that, and in his bizarre mind, he actually wants a nuclear war or something. Would you put it past him? Dude's pushing 80. He's clearly got dementia. He's clearly an insane, violent individual. I wouldn't put it past him at all. Of course, Putin, I think he's in his late 60s, so he remembers the glorious times of the Soviets too. Maybe he has nostalgia too. Maybe we're just returning to how I learned to love the bomb at the moment. That's about all. Peace out.